Last week we took a look at home birth together. Today we'll take a look at hospital birth together. There's really not much more to say than that in introduction, other than to say that if you haven't listened to episode 95 yet, go do that first, then come back and listen to this episode so that you can get the full picture, the full background in context, and understand the different pictures that we're painting on these two episodes. All right, so go do that, come back here, and let's go. Are you a Christian woman yearning for a beautiful, joyful pregnancy and birth with a focus on God, not medical tests? Are you worried the birth you want isn't possible and you're tired of being treated like an accident waiting to happen? Hey mama, I'm Lori, host of Your Birth God's Way. I'm a certified nurse midwife now, but I wasn't always. After working for nearly 20 years in the broken maternity system, I too was in your shoes wondering how I could have the birth I wanted and that I felt God meant for me to have. I found a secret that has actually been known since the beginning of time. God's way is the best way. Spoiler alert, God made us and our babies, and He knows us best. He designed us perfectly for pregnancy, birth, and nourishing our babies after birth, if we work with His design and not against it. In this podcast, you'll learn how to be healthy and have joy during this time of life that will be over before you know it. So if you're ready to reclaim your birth and your babies for His glory, go turn on a few episodes of Bluey for that little one on your hip so you can put the focus back on you for a few minutes with me. Quick review time again today. Today's review title says Just What I Needed. It's from Molly Jane 4, and I love Molly Jane 4's review because Molly Jane 4 is getting ready for baby number 5, and yet she's still here, she's still learning, she's still getting ready for this baby, and her review just says, this has been so encouraging to me as I prepare for baby number 5. And Molly Jane 4, what you don't know is how much you encouraged me by taking the, 10 seconds it took you to write that. It encourages me a ton, and it helps me find other mamas just like you who are either on baby number 1 or number 5 or maybe even number 10 who are trying to learn more about having their birth God's way. So thank you for taking the time to do that. And if you haven't left me a review yet, please take a time to do that. Just hit pause, go leave me a quick 5-star written review, and then come back here and we'll dive into this week's episode. I'll wait. Don't worry, you're not going to miss anything. I'm waiting. And you're back. Okay, so let's get started. So last week we looked at a typical home birth. If you haven't, again, listened to that yet, episode 95, go do that, because that was a picture of really what typical home birth looks like. Not every home birth, but most. It's a very peaceful thing. It's a very normal thing. It's a very calm thing. It is not a very scary thing. So I want you to go hear that picture that I painted of home birth. It was simple. It was smooth. It didn't have complications. I get that. It wasn't one that involved a transfer, and that's because most births are more like that than the kind that have complications arise that need a transfer. Most births just don't have those things at home. But today, we're going to look at hospital birth. You know those choose your own ending books that are out there? Sometimes they'll be kids' books. Sometimes I guess there's adult books like that too, where you read a story and then you get to pick how it ends. Well, that's kind of how this is, only this one is going to be choose your own beginning, because there are two different pictures of what moms look like when they go into a hospital for a hospital birth. There's the induction, and then there's the mom who's in labor. So we're going to start with the two different beginnings, and then they're going to kind of coalesce into the same finishing story towards the end. All right, so for the induction picture, let's start with that, because sadly, of those of you who are choosing to have a hospital birth, as many as a third or more of you are going to go this route. First thing, when you're being induced, you're told to come in at midnight, or maybe 10 p.m., or maybe 5 a.m., whatever crazy hour it is. I promise it's an ugly hour, and I promise it's not about you, but I digress. I'm already getting off track. Forgive me. So you're told to come in at midnight, some random date that they picked on a calendar. And when you get there, they welcome you into a nice room. It's bright. Has lots of papers sitting around maybe, or I guess maybe not as many papers these days since most of it's on the computer, but some papers laid around, some equipment laid out waiting on you. First, they put you on a monitor. They put one strap way down low on your belly to measure the baby's heart rate through an ultrasound. Then there's another strap that goes around up higher on your belly, and that one is there to measure the frequency of your contractions. Quick side note here. This monitor does not measure strength of contractions. Very often you'll see people in hospital rooms looking at that monitor thinking, wow, that was a strong contraction. The readings from an external monitor, and this episode is not going to go into internal monitors, but on external monitors, you cannot measure strength. And that is because if you take that same transducer and move it to a different part of your belly, you might not see the contraction at all. It's all about the placement. It's about how much of how close your uterus is to the skin, how fluffy you might be. All these things play into what that reading is going to look like. All you can truly measure for the external monitors is the frequency of your contractions and how long they're lasting. That's about it. You can't really measure strength. Okay, back to the story. So as they're putting on all these monitors, you're probably going to have somebody starting an IV in one of your arms or hands. They're also going to be getting a blood draw, taking some different labs, and you're probably going to have another person asking you a bunch of questions. Very oftentimes when you come in for an induction, there's kind of a team that comes in and they're trying to knock all these things out as quick as possible. So they're doing all these things at once, and it can seem very overwhelming for the mom. If you're the lucky person, or if you're lucky enough that the person is looking at you and actually talking to you like a human, you're doing great. But most likely the person who's asking you all the questions is actually staring at a computer screen, answering all the questions that they have there that are prescribed already for what they need to say. It often feels like just kind of a string of disjointed, irrelevant questions, but they have to ask them because if they don't, they get in trouble. So this picture goes on for a while with all the different people doing all the different things. From my experience as a nurse, most induction admissions look a whole lot like this, and they usually take an hour or more. So there's a whole lot of things going on for usually about an hour before it's all wrapped up. Once the IV is in, the monitors are on, the questions are answered, and consents are glossed over and signed. And when I say glossed over and signed, they'll bring it in and say, this is just saying that we have consent to treat you, blah, blah, blah. And if you look at it, there's a whole lot of words on there, a whole lot of things on there, but you're, not really thinking about it at this point. You're just trying to get it over with. So very often you just sign it. So they leave to go get the drugs ready to get your induction started. You might have a brief moment here of quiet when you kind of look over at your husband, maybe with a little sheepish smile, and think, oh, what just happened? You got this bewildered look on your face, wondering what in the world was that all about. Before you know it, the nurse is back in your room, explaining maybe just telling you what they're about to do, okay, and what they're about to use. She's got her medicine in her hand of whatever it is they're going to induce you with, whether it be a prostaglandin gel, Cytotec, Cervidil, you name it. Whatever they're about to do, she'll kind of tell you a little bit, hopefully ask you if you're okay with it, but probably just assume that you are since you came in for an induction. It's a fairly safe assumption that you're okay with these things. And see, whether you realize it or not, that first blanket statement consent form that you signed, they see that as you saying that you're okay with pretty much anything they want to do. They're just going to do it now. They might explain it a little bit, especially if you ask, but in general, they're just going to go on about their business because you came in, they assume you want all these things. All right, so what's in their hand? It might be a medicine, and in fact, it usually is a medicine. If you're coming in completely no contractions, especially first baby, no signs of labor at all, most likely the medicine that they're going to use is going to be something they're going to put up next to your cervix. If this is the case, this will probably be the first cervical check that you've had. If you've never had a baby before, maybe the first one you've ever had. And this is going to be a little eye-opening, to say the least, because if you're not in labor yet, again, especially if it's your first baby, your cervix is probably kind of pointing towards your spine. If you've never checked the cervix before, you might not know why that's significant. But as labor goes on, as you do a cervical check, it's just kind of right there when you stick your fingers in. It's really easy to find. But before labor started, for an induction or super early labor, that cervix is usually pointed at your back, and it's incredibly hard to get into. And because it's hard to get into, it's very uncomfortable for you. But to put these medications in that need to go up around your cervix somewhere, it's going to involve that check. First of all, they're going to want to know how far along you are anyway. And then they're going to need their fingers to be in the right place to put the medicine in the right place so that your labor gets going. If it's in the wrong place, it's not going to work as well. All right. So hopefully all this goes fairly easily, and hopefully this part will be over with fairly quickly, and they'll tuck you in and hope that you go to sleep. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. Time will tell. All right. Now let's take a different beginning. This beginning is the labor check. This is when you think you might be in labor and you're coming in for this purpose, not for an induction. So if you escape an induction and you're actually allowed to wait for labor to happen, but you're still planning to give birth at a hospital, you'll initially go into labor at home. I mean, that's the nature of it. You're not having an induction. You're not making labor happen. So labor is going to start at home, and then you're going to need to go to the hospital. Those first contractions that you're having, they're starting to get your attention. They'll seem intense, and you'll start to wonder, is it time? Now, if you've never been in labor before, you might not know how intense they are. You may not know that they're going to get stronger. You may not know these things yet. You've not been there before, and that's okay. You're going to wonder and you're going to doubt yourself. But you won't really know for sure. And at this point, you've been taught to trust the doctors and their opinions, not yourself. You're not going to sit there and actually decide for yourself if you're in labor. You're going to go in to see, quote, if you're in labor. So you'll likely load up everything and head into the hospital hoping that this is the real deal and hoping you're going to come home with your baby in your arms. When you walk into triage, you'll be met with a list of questions, kind of like the ones that you heard about in the induction side of the story. You'll be told to either wait or they may take you to a room to check you because you're not going to get admitted to a hospital without a cervical exam, period. So there is going to be a cervical exam where they stick their fingers into the bottom part of your vagina to see, the bottom part of your uterus, through your vagina to see if your cervix is dilated. This is that moment when moms start to think that they're failures and that they really don't know their bodies. Because very often those contractions, which seemed like the real deal, actually haven't opened up the cervix at all. You might find out you're closed, meaning it's not open at all, or maybe you're just 1 centimeter, which is barely a fingertip. The contractions that you promised them that you've been having all along are all but gone now. You feel crazy, like you shouldn't have wasted your time or theirs. They tell you to go back home and come back when contractions are every 5 minutes, lasting at least a minute. But in your head, you're thinking that's what they were already doing. And it got you nowhere. So you go home. And when they start again later in the day or maybe a few days from now, you're going to doubt yourself even more than the first time. And you're not going to know exactly what you need to do. Now, little side note again. You may not realize how common the scenario is that I just described, but it happens all the time. Your labor was real. I need you to hear that. Your labor was real. It's just that your subconscious mind shut it off when it perceived an unfamiliar, potentially unsafe situation. It is how God made us to protect our babies from being born in a situation or in a time that is not ideal. Just like he did for the animals, how he created animals to where they can cut their labors off. Ours do the same thing. And so don't think you're crazy. Don't think there's something wrong with you. What happened is your body did what God designed it to do. And it's trying to overcome this unfamiliar situation and wait. It's perceiving that, whoa, this isn't where we need to give birth. This isn't the right time. We got to wait. And so it cuts it off. And then you end up feeling crazy because in the eyes of the medical world, you came in here and you weren't even in labor. All right. I need you to grasp that picture and understand you're not crazy if you go into a hospital and when you get there, your labor stops. It happens every day. Okay. Back to the scenario. This scenario might happen, the whole going in and getting checked and all that. It may happen 3 or 4 times before your labor is strong enough and on a roll enough to continue past the interruption of coming into the hospital. Eventually, you'll come back in, though, and you'll be much more uncomfortable because the contractions are going to be more frequent and stronger. And maybe this time you're 4 or 5 centimeters and they admit you. From this point on, you'll maybe only get ice chips. There'll be no food or drinking water anymore, just in case you end up needing a C-section with general anesthesia. Even though that particular situation almost never happens, everyone is kept from eating or drinking just in case. At this point, all the things I listed for the induction happen to you. Okay, so remember when I said they came in and they got the straps and the IVs and all that? All of those things are going to happen for you. For you, your contractions are already on a roll. You're already uncomfortable during all this. So you've got strangers coming in and bright lights and questions and IVs and monitor straps, and you just are trying to focus on labor. Also, you won't get the medications that they were getting to get the labor started because obviously yours is already going. But rather, they'll move on to the next step, which is where they'll move on, which is where we're going to move on with the mom in just a minute for once the induced mom gets to 4 centimeters. At this point, when you get to about 4 or 5 centimeters, or if you're the induction, you get to about 4 or 5 centimeters, that's the point at which nearly every mom admitted to the labor floor will be put on what's called Pitocin. It's a synthetic form of oxytocin. Oxytocin is what your body makes naturally to create contractions, among other things. It has lots of other roles as well. Pitocin is the synthetic version. Overseas, there's another name for it that I've never quite figured out how to say, but it starts with an S. And if you're overseas, you know what I'm talking about, synestocin or something like that. I didn't write it down to know the exact pronunciation, but it's just a different name for the same thing. Pitocin's going to be started on just about every mom that walks into a hospital. It's a medication which should only be used when it's absolutely needed, and yet it's applied to nearly every mom who ever gives birth in a hospital without a second thought. It just is. It's standing orders. It's funny because in my notes, I usually jot down notes to remind me where I want to go next. I'm usually ahead of what I write down because I was about to say Pitocin is started through standing orders. Funny, that's the last thing I said. It's a standing order. That means that it'll say started at this, progress it up by this many units every this many minutes. And I can't tell you the exacts because every hospital does it a little bit different. But it doesn't really matter who you are. You just get a check in a box or a click in a box on a computer that basically lays out exactly what you're going to get. And most moms in that hospital are going to get the exact same thing. They're going to get the same cookie cutter dose, and it's increased by the same amount at the same time intervals. It's going to continue until the contractions are frequent enough to make them think that you should progress at least 1 centimeter per hour, because that's their minimum to feel like labor is progressing appropriately. Okay? So that's basically, they're trying to get you to the point where if you aren't progressing enough, it's because you're broken, not because the system's broken, and they can start you down the path where they want you to go to get you delivered in a certain amount of time. I know that sounds dark. I know that sounds ugly, but that's real. They want you in and out of that bed in a certain window of time based on your starting point and how long they think it should take you to give birth to this baby. And if you fall off of that curve that they want you to be on, you're going to get pressured in one way or another to try to get you back on it, or to end the pregnancy in a C-section. So contractions from Pitocin are very uncomfortable. And nearly every mom on Pitocin, which is what we call it PIT, by the way, nearly every mom that's on PIT ends up needing an epidural. So sometime in this process, you will probably decide that it's time for that epidural, and the anesthesia person will come in. It'll either be an anesthesiologist or a certified registered nurse anesthetist, CRNA. They will come in, they'll ask you a bunch more questions. Maybe they did it earlier. Sometimes they'll come in right at admission just to get it done before you're super uncomfortable. But if they were busy or maybe gone to lunch or something like that, they may have to do it now. So at the height of your discomfort and the height of you needing to be able to shut off your brain to labor, you're going to get to answer a whole bunch of questions, which is going to activate that part of your brain that needs to be shut off for you to be able to labor functionally. So then you're going to get put into a position that they want you in. It's usually going to be sitting up on the edge of the bed. You're going to have your head down. You're going to kind of hunch your back over to where you try to make your back as much like a C as you possibly can. You're going to kind of curl around your belly to give your back that curve. That curve is what's allowing them to put the needle into the right space, which is a very hard space to get into. They go through a long ritual of setting up their tools and their equipment. They clean themselves, they clean you, and through all this, remember, you're still having contractions, but you can't move because they've already put you in the position they want you in. So it's kind of miserable because you're hurting and you want to wiggle and you want to move and you want to pace and you want to sway, but you can't, because he's working on putting a needle into a precise space in your spinal cord it is a very important procedure that it goes into the right place. So you must be absolutely still. So think about that. If you've ever been in labor before, think about how hard it is to sit still during a contraction. That's what getting an epidural is. So they go through several more steps that I won't detail here, but eventually they'll get done. You'll lay down. Things will start to feel a little bit more numb, and you'll get a little bit more comfortable. But now you'll start to notice on the monitor frequently that the contractions seem to have spaced out. Now you have to look at the monitor now because you're probably not feeling the contractions anymore, right? But you can look over that monitor and notice that those little hills that used to look like where the contractions were aren't there as often. But guess what? Your nurse notices it too. And she comes in and starts to increase that PIT. Since you're nice and comfy now, they can really crank it up and get things going because they want that baby here, right? But see, your baby's in there your baby's not a fan of all these contractions, which are crazy strong now, and they're starting to come really close together now that they've cranked up the pit. Your baby shows us that he really can't take this by having some heart rate changes that start to make everybody a little bit nervous. There's certain ways that the baby's heart rate changes when it's not tolerating these contractions very well, and it'll make the staff get pretty nervous pretty fast. They turn their pit back. They cut it back, the rate of it back. They flow in a bunch of IV fluid, because that's one of the things you do when a baby's heart rate gets a little wonky is you start turning up the IV fluid, not the Pitocin. They start to move your position. They put oxygen on your face, and they're doing all these things to try to get the baby to perk back up and get its heart rate back to normal, which he does. Usually, it'll get right back to normal with some time. So different things can happen at this point. One thing that can happen is that labor will progress as fast as they want it to, and with time, they'll tell you it's time to push. If this is your path, if this is what happens for you, your legs will be put up in stirrups, and they'll be lifted for you by your nurse or your husband or whomever, and they'll be pushed back and held for you every time you have a contraction. Your nurse or maybe a doctor are going to be sitting on the bottom of your bed, the lower part, or maybe the bed's already been broken down. By that, what I mean is that bottom section of your bed actually will come off, and they'll ask you to slide down to the end, and they'll just stand there at the end of the bed with your feet up in stirrups around them, bright light shining at your vagina, and every time you have a contraction, the people are going to count to 10 3 different times and tell you to push during those 10-second counts. So you're basically pushing, and you'll be surprised at how slow that 10 seconds can be. They'll count to 10 once, tell you to take a deep breath, push again, count to 10, deep breath, push again, count to 10. And you're going to seem like you're going to feel like you're getting dizzy. You're going to feel exhausted. But if you keep doing it and everything goes well, eventually your baby will be born. Now, the reason they have to coach you on how to push is because, remember, you're numb. So you don't have those same sensations to know when to push. So it's all kind of you're told how to do it. Okay. That's one picture. Labor progresses. You end up pushing, baby's born. Okay? Different scenario. Labor doesn't progress like they want it to. And so if this is the case, then they're going to start planting the seeds for needing a C-section, because they'll say something like, this baby just isn't going to come out this way, meaning vaginally. It's interesting, though, if you'll notice that those seeds tend to be planted leading up to dinner time or maybe around 9 o'clock, because if you look at statistics, there's a spike in C-section rate Monday through Friday around 5 o'clock and around 10 o'clock, because the doctor doesn't want to miss dinner and the doctor doesn't want to stay all night. Those are the two spikes. They're just over it. They don't think this is going to happen. They don't really trust that you're going to be able to do this. So let's just get this over with and get your baby here. Okay? So that's the second one. The third option is that your baby keeps having these heart rate changes because of all this Pitocin and the epidural and everything, and they will call it what's called fetal intolerance of labor, which is really fetal intolerance of induction, not labor, because this is nothing like what labor normally is for a baby. So they either create an actual emergency from all these medications to where a C-section is truly needed to save your baby's life at this point, or they'll just say that the baby's not handling labor well, so you need a section. In that case, it's not really an emergency, but they go ahead and do it. Okay, so these are the three most common endings of a hospital birth. Either you manage to have the vaginal birth, you get the seeds planted for not being able to have this baby vaginally, or they create an emergency and then they make you think that they just saved your baby's life, when really none of those things probably would have ever happened had the induction and all the medications never happened. Okay, it's a harsh truth. After the birth, the baby will usually be taken away from you at some point to either be cleaned and to get measurements and shots and all that comes with a hospital birth. You can learn more, by the way, about all those things that are done done routinely in birth in my online Christian childbirth education course, so that you can decide if you really want those things. And then after that, you're going to be taken to a postpartum floor where once you can move your legs and you can pee and all that stuff after the epidural is removed, you'll get taken to a postpartum floor. You may go with your baby. You may go to the postpartum floor on your own. Your baby goes to the nursery. It depends on the hospital and how they have things set up. You're just going to have to figure that stuff out. You're going to have to ask them, wherever the hospital is that you're going to, how they normally proceed through these things. If you manage to have an uncomplicated vaginal birth, you'll probably go home about 48 hours later or so. If you have any complications or if you have a C-section, it may be 72 hours later or more in some cases, just depending on what happened, what went on. Then you'll go home and you won't really see anybody to check on you again for 2 weeks if it was a C-section or 6 weeks if it was a vaginal delivery. And that's a really long time. I forgot to mention this in the last episode about what it looks like postpartum, because that's one of the best parts of a home birth is the postpartum part. And I don't know why I didn't think to include this, but I want to tell you now that for home births, most midwives will come back the next day after birth and maybe also the next day after that. And then again at a week, and another time maybe a week or so later, and then again at 4 weeks to 6 weeks or somewhere around in there. The routine of when they come varies based on the practice and the midwives, but they see you frequently in those first few days to ensure that you're transitioning to motherhood well. And that's a beautiful part of home birth that you just don't get with a hospital birth, because with a hospital birth, when you go home, no one's coming to check on you. You're just home. There's no help with nursing, no help with pain, no help with anything unless you've arranged for it on your own. So it's kind of interesting because at that point, you become more like a home birth mom because you're having to do all that part on your own anyway, on top of what all you've probably had to come out of pocket for after insurance at the hospital. But I digress. So I know that picture can seem a little grim, and I know that you probably think I'm biased, and I am a little bit, because I know this isn't what birth should be like. And I'm hoping that many of you will see the beauty of home birth and opt to see if giving birth at home would be a good option for you. It's not a good option for everyone, but it's a good option for most women. When I tell you that the picture that I painted, both of the home birth and of the hospital birth, are common, please hear what I'm telling you. Those are the most common pictures. Yes, there's different details for each, but those are the most common pictures. And over the years that I worked in labor and delivery, most of the births looked like one of those three that I described with the three endings. Most of them. It is not uncommon at all. Some may still walk away with happy memories of their birth, but if you get into the weeds of the details of their births, most moms are going to tell you that it looked a whole lot like one of those. Now, this wasn't, again, every single detail, but I just wanted you to get the overall picture, especially for those of you who have never had a baby before. I go over all of the details, each and every one of all the choices that you can make in birth in my online Christian childbirth education course, which I would love to have you join because I want you to be informed, not helpless, when you're making these decisions. The beauty of getting the education from me, someone who is not influenced by insurance or hospital policy, is that you get the truth of all sides and you're going to get the information that you need to make the decisions for yourself. If you get the education from a hospital, they are just going to indoctrinate you to their way of doing things so that you fall in line. I promise you this. I was this. You hear me? I know it. I was it. So now I want you to take some time to think about what you heard last episode and what you heard this episode. Think about where the safety was. Think about where the peace was, where the baby was able to come naturally and where the labor was manipulated. Where was God's plan for birth honored and where was man's need to control things honored? These are two very different pictures. And if you've started to realize that home birth isn't so scary, the next thing you need to do is to pre-register for the home birth prep course I'll be holding live with you over Zoom starting July 11th. Doors will be opening in the next week or so, and the people who have pre-registered will not only have the first chance to grab their seat, but they'll also get the best price, and they'll get a chance to bundle it with the main Christian childbirth education course I mentioned just a minute ago. So you'll get an amazing deal that I've never offered anywhere else. This course will help you and your husband get on the same page, or maybe you and your mom, or you and your in-laws, or whoever. It'll help you to know the supplies that you need and help you get them. It'll help you have the right setup. It'll help you know what you need for water birth if that's what you want, and it'll help you get it. It'll help you know how to manage postpartum and newborn care when you've never left home, like you would have with a hospital birth. It'll help you know what you need and how to be ready if a transfer is needed. You're going to walk away with a solid plan for that home birth, the home birth that you've dreamed of and that God designed you to have. So go get pre-registered now. Go to go.yourbirthgodsway.com/homebirthprep. That's go.yourbirthgodsway.com/homebirthprep. I hope your name is the next one that I see on the list, and I will see you right back here next week with a new episode. Real quick, if today's episode blessed you in any way, would you head over to Apple Podcasts and leave me a quick 5-star written review? It'll take you less than a minute, but it's the best thank you you can give me, and it will help my show to reach more mamas just like you, so we can all find God's best for our families. I'll see you right back here in a few days.